My next guest is a music theatre performer, puppeteer, set builder and puppet maker. He's performed in Disney's Winnie the Pooh, Avenue Q and many, many others. Welcome to Showtime, Andy McDougall.
Thanks for having me.
Andy, I have so many questions, but I guess to start, how did you first get interested in puppetry and puppet making?
Oh, God, that's a big question. I think the easiest way to explain it is growing up watching Sesame Street on TV and The Muppet Show and just being fascinated with them, seeing these bits of fabric moving around, having their own life and going, that's something I really want to do. And so I started just making like paper bag puppets as a kid. My earliest one was, I think it was in grade 1. And we used to have puppeteers come to my primary school and put on shows. I used to always go up to them afterwards and chat to them. And yeah, eventually ended up making some friends with some of them and got involved with the puppetry community that way.
What was the first puppet you ever made?
The first puppet I ever made was, and this is actually very embarrassing, it was a Prince Charles puppet.
I need more information.
Yeah, my mum had this weird paper mache toy as a kid, and I thought it looked like Prince Charles. It was just this weird head with big ears, and my brain just instantly went, that's Prince Charles. So I took to it with a pair of scissors and cut it like a little jaw piece from it, made it look like a little ventriloquist dummy, and stuck a skewer up it to move the jaw, and that was my first, like, actual puppet that looked like a puppet. Before that was paper bag
How old
puppets.
were you?
That would have been...
When you made the Prince Charles puppet?
Oh, God, that would have been 7.
Wow. And you mentioned before paper bag puppets and probably sock puppets and stuff.
Yeah.
But the Prince Charles puppet was the first puppet you made.
The Prince Charles was the first puppet. All the paper bag puppets, I don't really classify them as my first puppet because they were quick 5-minute sort of, I'm going to throw this together and have a play kind of thing.
Do you still have the His Majesty's puppet?
No, I think that disintegrated a good 15 years ago and went to the dumpster at Mum and Dad's.
Was it formal training, self-taught? How did you get to where you are now?
Well, I started off being self-taught, just watching stuff on TV, trying to figure out how it was being made. So it was sort of reverse engineering stuff in my own head. And then as the age of YouTube came about, yes, I am that old. I remember when YouTube first started. A lot of sort of puppeteers and puppet makers started putting tutorials online. So I started getting some more information that way. And then I actually ended up being in the industry for so long that I ended up going to VCA and doing a post grad in puppetry. And I learned a whole bunch of new skills there as well.
VCA, Victorian College of the Arts, for those watching not in Melbourne.
Yes.
So you did a puppet course at VCA?
Yes, I did. So it was back in 2004. It was the inaugural year of the Post Graduate in Puppetry. The course no longer exists, unfortunately, because its funding got cut. And then I think from that course, we had 2 master's students come through as well. So there are 2 people in Australia who have a master's in puppetry.
And when you're designing a puppet, I mean, there are some puppets that, you know, like Avenue Q or Little Shop of Horrors, where, you know, there's a very established style for those puppets. And, you know, you put your own spin on them, as I know you are with Avenue Q, which we'll chat about soon. But then there are some shows where you've got the freedom to create whatever is coming out of the imagination of you and the team of creatives that you're collaborating with. How do you approach that process of creating a puppet?
It's all very collaborative. So say, for example, with Three Little Pigs, I built the owl puppets for that. So that was in consult with yourself and the director. I asked for some sort of idea images of what you guys were looking at. And I then created a sketch based around that, knowing the scale and how it was going to be operated. So there's 2 ways you can actually approach how to design a puppet. There's how you want it to look and how it operates. So if you're going purely for aesthetic, you've then got to build everything into that shape that you've created in your drawing or your maquette. And if you're going with how something operates, then you've got from the inside out. So you can either go outside in or inside out.
And what do you think's the most challenging puppet you've ever created?
It was Pod 4 for Little Shop of Horrors for Audrey 2. So it was for an Amdram company, and it had to be operated by one puppeteer, and that puppeteer was myself. So that was a bit of I could just have that, cool, I can just sort that out. I know how it's going to operate kind of thing. But trying to create a puppet that is basically the size of a small hatchback that can be operated by one person. That was very much a challenge. Like, cool, I know I can build something that fits around a hand and is completely structurally sound, but as soon as you scale something up to that size, the
So
engineering
by
in it,
hatchback, you mean a small car?
yeah. So
Wow.
it was the size of a small hatchback car.
Yeah,
This thing was
that's
huge.
incredible.
So yeah, once
And
you
were you
scale it up,
inside it? How did it work?
yeah. So there's lots of ways that Audrey 2s can be operated. Some of them are on like a cantilever system, like so there's like a steel rod that goes into the ground and it pivots like that, and the person stands inside it to open and close the mouth. Now, those are great because they're really simple to use. They're all weighted. You don't have to put much effort into it. But I find they're stuck in one spot.
Mm.
So about 25 years ago, I actually used a puppet for Little Shop of Horrors from a company in Campbelltown in Sydney. And they came up with the most ingenious way of having this thing completely able to move around on stage. And it was using the person as that cantilever point. And so what happened was I had this little cutout that my legs fit through in the bottom of the jaw. And so if they're my legs, you stood there with your legs out like that, and you sort of squatted down, and the pod rested on your knees, but the back of the hole you sat on. So it was completely centered on its center of gravity. So I could literally just stand there and this thing would sit up off the ground, and just by tilting my hips back and forward, I could get the pod to go up and down. Just twisting my body, I could do that. And the great thing is, in the finale, instead of the puppet just staying there and all these leaves coming out, you could actually walk the pod forward towards the audience, so it looked like it was going to eat the audience.
We've talked about how puppets are put together and how important that is, and how the way they're put together can either help or hinder the performance. But there's also the performer part, isn't there? And how do you approach giving a puppet personality and putting that life into a puppet that audiences can really relate to?
Great question. It's really just like acting. So an actor uses their body as their tool. As a puppeteer, depending on the style of puppetry, so with Avenue Q, I've got to instill everything that my body would be as an actor is put down into my hand. So everything that my upper torso does, I've got to go from here up with. I've got to make sure that every bit of movement that I would put into it goes into my hand. So if I'm doing a pensive look to the audience, usually as an actor, you'd tilt your head, you'd look out in the distance, you do all that stuff, and you put this thought process into it, and people can read it on your face. With a puppet, there's very rarely any facial feature movement unless it's got a whole bunch of mechanisms. So with Avenue Q puppetry, they're very simple. They don't have moving eyes. They only have a moving mouth because of your jaw. And so you've got to be able to instill that essence into your hand. So you've got to make sure you can get head tilts. You can focus where the eyes go, because eye focus as an actor and a puppet are very important, because that tells the audience where you're engaged with, what you are thinking, all that kind of stuff.
What's the favourite puppet you've ever worked with?
Personally, my favourite puppet that I use is a character called Wes, and I built him for my VCA graduating piece. And he's this little he's literally this big, tiny little hand puppet, but he was part of a cabaret, and his name's Wes because it stood for Work Experience Student. And the original idea was in every scene, because him and the stage manager puppet were meant to be the in-betweeners to cover set changes. They were kind of like a mixture between Kermit the Frog and Fozzie Bear kind of thing, that back and forward backstage. And in each of those in-betweeners, he was meant to be killed. And in the next in-between section, a box would be delivered with brand new work experience student, and you take the same puppet out. So it was like they were interchangeable. But he was just a very nice little fitted puppet that you could get a lot of movement out of with very little effort. So that's been my favourite personal one to use. But my overall favourite puppet to use has actually been Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. He was a beautiful looking puppet. He weighed a ton. He was the heaviest puppet in the entire show, but so beautiful in the way you could get him to emote because of the way his eyes were focused and the way his jaw sat. Just a little tiny little move of the handle on the back of his head down, you could get him looking up at Pooh and just going, ugh. And from just a tiny little move of your hand, this big head just goes boom. And he's got weight to him. He's beautiful puppeteers.
Avenue Q is opening on the 22nd of February at the National Theatre. You are making the puppets for that show, but you're also in that show as Nikki and Trekkie. How's that experience been, to be making puppets but also being a part of the show?
It's been really interesting. It's the third time that I've done that sort of role. So the first time I did Avenue Q back in 2011, I think it was. I helped Andrew and Company build a set of puppets for that. It was just like working bee kind of stuff. They weren't very good, but they were great for what we had at the time. It's just really interesting to be on both sides of the process. So having that back end where you're building the puppets, you know what they're going to look like, you know how they're going to operate in that, and then being a performer on stage at the same time. And it kind of gives me a little bit of an unfair advantage because I know how they're built and how they operate, so I know how far I can push them. So sometimes I feel like I've got a bit of a little edge on the competition when it comes to that.
With a show like Avenue Q, I mean, you know, it's a funny show. It's a sometimes raw and gritty show. How do you think puppets help break down those barriers and connect audiences with what they're seeing on stage?
Well, that's the thing with puppets. They're an effigy. They're a symbol of what you want to be saying. For example, there's a song in the show, Everyone's a Little Bit Racist. Yeah, we've got human characters singing that, but because they're singing it with some of the puppet characters, there's that filter of, oh, they're talking to the puppets about it. So it comes across as they're educating the puppets, but also the puppets have an innocence about them. So it's not said with anything that's got malice behind it. It's all about, this is just factual. And it's funny as hell because they're trying to have that whole racism conversation. But because it's puppets, you go, okay, cool, I can sit back and actually observe this objectively. It's not a subjective conversation that you'd have if it was two people on stage. Because with people, you've got all the subtext of their history, the history of humanity, of how screwed up it is around racism a lot of the time. But when it's the puppets, there's sort of this blank slate and you can have this very funny and open conversation about it.
And it's done in a really funny, somewhat flippant way, but they're actually important messages, aren't they?
They really are. And there's a lot of stuff in this show that's like that. It's learning how to live as an adult in the modern world, which most of us are failing at. There's how to deal with social constructs such as racism, relationships, growing up, all that kind of stuff. And using puppets to tackle those messages and those conversations, it just makes it a lot more palatable for audiences, which is why you can push it so far with those puppets, and it becomes so funny because of how far you push it.
And you're playing two main characters in Avenue Q, Nikki and Trekkie.
Yep.
Now, both of those puppets are fairly unique in that they're two-person operated puppets.
Yeah,
how
in the
hard
show,
is that?
It's really hard to gel with your second puppeteer at the very start of the process, but eventually you start thinking the same way, and it's kind of scary at times. So most of the puppets in this show are puppets which are hand rod puppets. So you've got your hand inside the head and you're holding rods, kind of like chopsticks to operate the arms. So the rod comes out of the hand so they can move their hands around like that. With Nikki and Trekkie, I've got my hand in his head, and then I've got one hand in his left hand. And then I've got a second
sort of like a
here.
glove.
Yeah, like a glove. It's literally a glove puppet. And then my second puppeteer has their right hand in the puppet's right hand. So it actually has two live hands. So a lot of the time they're called a live hand puppet because they've got live hands. And so there's myself and my second puppeteer, who's Perry in the show. And we're constantly having to have discussions on, right, to get over there, we're going to take 4 steps, or are we going to take 3 steps? How are we going to move? Is it going to be a fast walk? Is it going to be a run, a skip? How are we going to do this? And eventually we get in sync where we're actually breathing at the same time. So it's just one entity.
Andy, it's been over 20 years since Avenue Q was first shown to an audience in New York. What do you think it is that audiences still connect with this show all this time later?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, one, it's puppets. People love watching puppets sing and do stupid stuff on stage. They always have and they always will. It's gone back millennia. Like, puppetry is one of the first forms of storytelling that we had. But the actual themes and subjects in this show are still completely relevant today. Like, even though it's 20 years old, very little in this show has dated. There's stuff that is still completely relevant to today, and like, people are still struggling to adult in this modern world. People are still struggling with discussions about racism. People are still struggling with relationships between each other and just finding that balance of being an adult and enjoying life still as a child. It's the discussions that happen within the show are still completely relevant.
I don't know about you, but one of the things I really love about the show is it does all of those things that you suggest, but it never really feels preachy. It's always fun. It's always funny. Even when it's a little bit racist, pardon the pun, it's still respectful.
Exactly. They never cross the line. They push the hell out of the line, but they never cross it. And that's good writing. Because people can make jokes about people being racist and relationships and adulting and all that, and sometimes they go too far. Quite often they go too far. But with Avenue Q, they literally go up to the line and they look over the line and they're about to step over it, and then they pull it back and they twist it. And when they twist it, that's what makes it very funny. And that's what makes people go, oh, they're about to cross it. And as soon as the audience goes, hang on, they haven't crossed the line, but they've actually made me look at it from a different perspective, that's when you get that connection and people actually understand what the show's about.
I'm chatting with Andy McDougall, who's a puppet maker and puppeteer working on Avenue Q that opens on the 22nd of February at the National Theatre in St Kilda. For more info and to book tickets, visit avenueq.com.au. Andy, thank you so much for the chat, and chookers for an awesome season.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.